Hi everyone, it's Clive. Welcome back to the Mitchell Brewery. The boiler's on. Let's get ready to start brewing beer. This is my boiler and we're not far off 100. I put this on about 7:30 this morning. Normally takes anything between an hour and a half and 2 hours to get up to 100. When it's got up to 100 degrees, I then let it cool down to 80 and then I can get on with the next stage of the brewing process. When I'm brewing, I normally make a note of what I'm doing, and you can see I've already jotted down the recipe, and I'm using Maris Otter as the bulk of the malt, so 4.4 kgs. Then I've got some crystal and I've got some rolled oats. And for hops, I'm going to be using Cascade and SARS. And I've added a Camden tablet, that's to neutralise any chlorine in the tap water, and I'll use a bright water tablet, and then also later on I'll use Mangrove Jack's Liberty Bell yeast for the actual fermentation. This is the bright wort, and it's basically what you add to help flocculate out all the sort of extra solids to help clarify the beer. This is the Maris Otter extra pale malt this time. I've never used extra pale, I've normally just used ordinary Maris Otter pale malt, so this should make my beer a little bit lighter in colour. You can see this is barley which has been malted, and that means the process where the barley is allowed to germinate. That germination process is then stopped. This sort of the germination process creates the sugar, which was ultimately would have been the sort of growing energy for the plant. That malt is then kilned, and this is what you end up with. And in various degrees of kilning result in various different sort of darknesses of malt. The more kilning you do, the darker the colour, and hence the darker the colour of the beer. So plenty of sugar in here to convert to alcohol. This is crystal malt. It's distinctly different. It gives a different, a bit of a sharper flavour, and it gives a bit more character to the beer. The third malt I'm adding are actually porridge oats, rolled oats. Yes, it's a bit weird maybe, but believe it or not, this actually helps with what we call head retention, i.e. keeping the nice foamy head on your beer. So I always add a bit of rolled oats. Now the water's less than 80, I'm going to transfer about 10 litres into the mash tun and mix up with the malt. Here we go, I'm going to add the second lot, 2 litres. Now ideally what you want to do is mix up this malt with the water. Now there might be a dry patch at the very bottom, so you have to excavate that and let the water be in contact with all of the malt, because you don't want any dry patches. If it's a dry patch, that sugar won't go into solution. Okay, this is thoroughly mixed. What I do now is add the lid, and I've also got a cover that I put on top of it just to insulate it a bit more. That's the mash tun covered. That will now stay there for an hour and a half to let the water dissolve the sugar from all the malts and produce a nice sweet wort. So while that's happening, I need to fill the boiler back up because we need to create some sparge water. I'll explain what sparging is later. I reckon that's boiling. So let's just turn it off and let it cool down. The mash tun is nearly ready, but I'll just show you what I've done here. I've attached this hose onto the tap of the boiler. Now this is just at 80, so it's ready for sparging. And you can see at the end of this pipe there's the fine rose from a watering can, and the idea is that this water then goes through this rose, which is then sprinkled over the malt to wash out the sugary goodness into a container, and that is sparging. You'll see what I mean in a mo. Okay, let's take the lid off the mash tun. And the first thing you get when you do this, you get this amazing Ovaltine sort of malty aroma that rushes out of the malt. It's absolutely incredible. It's one of my favourite things in brewing. Smell the goodness. So the next thing I do is I drain off the first sort of flush of sweet wort Now this will have a lot of sort of fines in the solution, and this is really strong smell over creamy malty goodness. And what I'll do when this is drained out is I'm going to tip it back through here. This malt then sort of acts as a filter bed to capture those fine particles to help try and clarify this beer a bit more. Here we go. I've poured out a little bit of the sweet wort, and you can see it didn't look terribly appetising, but I'd encourage you to try it just so you sort of experience what the whole thing's about. And you can see that's really sugary, that's really going to rot your teeth, but that's all the sugar that's going to convert to alcohol. Fantastic. So now I'm going to start sparging, and I just turn on the tap, and you can see what I do is I play this water over the surface of the malt, and then this washes the sugary solution through. And obviously we need to turn on the tap, and let's see how long this takes. Sparging's taken just over 15 minutes, and I've got about 30 litres of sweet wort. This needs to go back into the boiler to boil up, and then we start adding the hops. At this stage the sweet wort's about 60 degrees, which is a little bit higher than normal. It's normally about 56. Just preparing to add the first addition of hops, and I've got Cascade here. You can see that this is in the form of pellets. It used to be leaf, and now it's much more common to get pellet hops, which are sort of compressed into these things, a bit more concentrated than the leaf pellets. Only problem with them is they disintegrate right down to a mush, so I usually add into a sort of fine mesh bag to try and control that mush and minimise the amount of sort of like fines in the beer. Give it a bit of a stir, because sometimes it overflows at this stage, so if you stir it, it sort of calms things down a little bit, evens out the temperature in the boiler and stops it from overflowing. As you can see, I've just added the first hop addition. There you go. Okay, that's the end of the hop boil. Let's turn off the boiler and add the last hop addition. These are for the aroma hops, which go at the end. So what I'll do now is I'll turn on the chiller. You can see the chiller's already in here. I then turn on the tap. Now the chiller is a copper coil which is submerged in here, and it acts as a heat exchanger. Cold water goes at the bottom, hot water comes out here, and this is really hot now, this pipe. So that's going all the way to the outside tap. It's taken about 20 minutes to go from 100 to 30 using the copper chiller. Now the bitter wort, which if you remember we started with sweet wort and adding hops converts it to bitter wort. Now the bitter wort is cooled to less than 30, we can transfer it to the fermentation bin. Right, it's 5 days after I put the bitter wort and the yeast into the primary fermentation bin. This seems to have worked really quickly this time, because it's completely finished after 5 days. So let's just have a quick look in here. You see that's the dry hops that I added in a couple of days ago. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to siphon off into this pressure barrel. I've added some beer finings which will help clarify the beer. I'm also going to sterilise a whole bunch of bottles, because I'm going to transfer this beer tomorrow into some bottles, and the beer will then brew in the bottles. One simple way to get the siphoning going is to fill up the tube with water, and then to lower the siphon into the beer and then let the water run off. That will then drag the beer up the tube, and then we can then transfer into here. Here we go, siphoning in action. You can see the siphoning wand is in the fermentation bin. The beer is coming into the pressure barrel. I filled up a couple of measuring cylinders and I use a my hydrometer to measure the gravity of the beer at this stage. On the home straight now, this beer's been in here for a couple of days. I'm going to siphon it into these bottles when they're ready and cleaned and they just need to be rinsed out. I've got some maltose, which I'm going to add. I'm going to make a solution and then add 10 ml of a sugary solution, which will then kickstart the secondary fermentation, put a cap on, and those beers will stay in there for 3 or 4 weeks and then they'll be ready. Cool, let's get on with it. Sterilising the bottles is quite time consuming. These have been soaking in milk and sterilising solution for a couple of days. And then what I normally do is I tip them out and then I fill them up with water, sluice it out, fill them up again, let them soak, then empty them out, and then I take that as clean. I've attached the bottling wand to the tap. Now this has got a sort of like a little device at the bottom that when you open the tap, this should stop the beer from pouring onto the floor. Can you see? So basically that's a little activator at the bottom, so when you put your glass or your bottle in here, it... Oh, look at that. Oh, that gives me a cheeky taste at the second. Let's have another cheeky taste of that. This is tasting really good. What I'm going to do now is take 10 ml of the sugary solution and put it into each of the bottles, and that'll act as an activator to kickstart the secondary fermentation. And what I do now is take my bottle, and you can see it filling up, maybe you can't, and what you want to do is leave the sort of up to about here in the bottle, and that'll give you a bit of leeway called the ullage for it to brew properly in the bottle. There you go, perfect. So I just need to do the rest. It's not bad, got 37 bottles out of the barrel. So next up is putting on one of the caps. I've got the crown capper here, and that basically just levers this thing on, click, and I've got 36 more to do. There we have it, 37 bottles all capped, and that will now go in an ice dark cupboard and for about 3 or 4 weeks to turn into beer. Cheers then everyone, that's the end of the video. Happy brewing!